When we close our eyes at night, we do so in a world that hums quietly with electricity. Even in darkness, there is a soft glow from street lamps outside, the faint blue pulse of screens in standby, or the low hum of a refrigerator in the next room. It is difficult for us, surrounded as we are by the comforts of modern life, to imagine a time when the coming of night was not simply a signal to rest, but a transformation of the world itself. For the medieval peasant, the sun was the one true measure of safety. Its light marked the hours of work, its warmth nourished the crops, and its steady path across the sky offered a sense of order in an otherwise uncertain life. But when the sun fell, and the last streaks of gold faded from the horizon, the world did not merely grow dim, it became hostile, unknown, and deeply unsettling. Darkness was not passive, it was an active presence, one that pressed close against the fragile walls of cottages and huts. It swallowed the landscape, it blurred the familiar, and it left peasants vulnerable to forces both natural and imagined. The medieval night was filled with fears that are almost foreign to us today. Without the comfort of electric light, every sound carried a weight of menace. The rustle of leaves outside could be a thief moving through the shadows. The snap of a twig might be a wolf circling the edges of the village. An owl's cry, echoing across the fields, was sometimes taken as an omen of death. For the peasant family gathered in their one-room dwelling, the night was a test of endurance, a passage through uncertainty, until the dawn returned to scatter what they believed were lurking spirits and prowling beasts. Yet the darkness also had a curious stillness. Imagine it, a silence broken only by the slow crackle of embers dying in the hearth. Outside, the wide expanse of fields and forests lay under a moonlit sky, silver light washing across rooftops, barns and hedgerows. In the distance perhaps a stream murmured, or the wind bent the trees into gentle sighs. For those who dared to listen closely, the night had its own rhythms, unsettling at times, but also strangely beautiful. But for the common peasant, beauty was often overshadowed by danger. Nightfall was not something to savor, it was something to endure. This sense of danger was heightened by the fragility of medieval homes themselves. Most peasants lived in cottages, made of timber frames filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of clay, straw and mud. Roofs were often thatched, floors made of packed earth, and doors secured by nothing more than wooden bars. These houses were not fortresses. They could not easily keep out the chill of winter air, nor the intrusions of desperate men. To live in such a dwelling meant knowing that the boundary between the safety of family life and the perils of the outside world was paper thin. And so, when the darkness descended, families gathered close together. The peasant household was not spread across multiple rooms, as in modern homes. It was compressed into a single living space, where sleeping, eating and working life blurred together. The hearth burned at the center, its smoke lingering thickly in the rafters. Around it on straw mats, or simple wooden platforms, the family lay down to rest. The fire was their only guard against cold, their only light against shadows. But it could not last through the entire night. Wood was scarce, and firewood expensive to gather or buy. As the flames sank into embers, the night crept closer, filling the gaps left by the dwindling glow. It was in this context that peasants turned to an unusual but practical solution. They did not pass the night alone. They invited their animals, their most trusted sources of food and livelihood, into their very homes, even into the same spaces where they and their children slept. To us this might seem strange, even unpleasant, but for them it was a matter of survival. Before we explore the reasons for this practice in detail, we must first understand the mindset that shaped the medieval peasants' relationship with night. Unlike us, they did not think of darkness as an absence of light. Darkness was a living force, one tied to folklore, religion, and superstition. They believed the devil moved more freely at night. Witches, it was said, met under the cover of the moon to cast spells. Spirits of the dead were thought to wander the earth when shadows were deepest. Even the most rational men and women carried these fears quietly in their hearts. For them the night was not neutral, it was dangerous, it was sacred, and it was profoundly mysterious. This atmosphere of fear was compounded by very real dangers. Wolves and bears were not yet extinct across much of Europe. Bandits roamed the roads, and poor harvests often drove desperate men to steal. Villages were small, and while communities tried to protect one another, isolation was common. A family living on the edge of a settlement might hear sounds outside their door, footsteps, growls, scratching, and have no way to know whether it was a neighbor in need or a predator looking for prey. And so peasants clung together, huddling in warmth and proximity. They trusted not just in one another, but in the company of their animals. Animals brought warmth, security, and a sense of life in the silence of the night. A cow shifting its weight, a pig snuffling in the straw, or a dog growling softly in warning. These were sounds that reassured as much as they disturbed. They meant the family was not alone. To imagine this world is to step into a rhythm of life almost forgotten today. The medieval night was heavy and long, stretching across hours that felt endless without the clock faces we now take for granted. It was a time for reflection, for stories told by firelight, for whispered prayers to saints and angels. But it was also a time of unease, a reminder of how fragile human life was, and how small the peasant family stood against the great expanse of darkness. And so when we ask why peasants slept with their animals, the answer is rooted first in this reality. Night was not merely the absence of light, it was an ordeal, a presence to be endured. To survive it, peasants needed warmth, they needed protection, and they needed reassurance that life, both human and animal, surrounded them in those long hours before the dawn. This is the world we must step into if we are to understand their choices, a world where darkness itself was an adversary, where fragile homes offered little shield, and where the bond between human and animal was forged in the shared struggle to endure the night. If we wish to truly understand why medieval peasants shared their sleeping quarters with animals, we must step through the low wooden doorway of their homes and look closely at the space in which life unfolded. For the home was not simply a backdrop, it was the very stage upon which survival, comfort, fear, and necessity played out. To imagine this world, we must leave behind the walls of brick and stone that surround us today and enter a place both fragile and deeply human. The typical peasant dwelling was modest in size, often little more than a single room. At its core stood a wooden frame filled with wattle and daub, strips of woven branches smeared with a paste of clay, mud, straw, and animal dung. It was a building material both ingenious and humble, using what was readily at hand, yet it left the walls thin, rough, and prone to cracking. In the depths of winter, cold winds whistled through the gaps, and rainwater seeped inside, dampening everything in its path. The floor beneath one's feet was rarely made of planks or stone, more often it was bare earth, compacted through years of footsteps. It absorbed spills, retained smells, and turned to mud in the wet months. The cottage itself felt less like a sealed refuge from the world, and more like a porous shell, one that let the elements slip easily through. The roof, more often than not, was thatched. Bundles of straw, reeds, or heather were layered thickly and tied in place, creating a surprisingly effective shield against rain. But thatch brought its own dangers. It could easily catch fire from a stray ember drifting up from the hearth, and in the warmer seasons, it offered an irresistible home for insects, birds, and even rodents. A peasant might drift to sleep to the scurrying of mice overhead, or the fluttering wings of sparrows nesting just above. Inside, the air was heavy with smoke. Most cottages lacked chimneys in the early medieval centuries. The hearth stood at the center of the room, its flames licking upward, its smoke rising and collecting in the rafters before slowly filtering out through gaps in the thatch. The ceiling beams grew black with soot, and the smell of smoke clung stubbornly to clothing, bedding, and skin. For the peasant family, this was simply the scent of home. To us it would sting the eyes and choke the lungs. Furniture was sparse and rudimentary. A sturdy wooden table might stand near the hearth, its surface rough with years of use. Benches or stools, carved from logs, offered seating. Beds, as we know them, were rare among the poorest families. Instead, straw pallets were spread across the floor, sometimes raised slightly on wooden frames, sometimes not at all. These were shared among family members, who slept huddled together for warmth. Coarse woolen blankets, patched and threadbare, covered their bodies. To lie down at night was not to sink into softness, but to settle into the scratchy embrace of straw, always alive with the risk of fleas and lice. the home was not neatly divided into rooms with specific purposes. Rather, all of life, eating, working, sleeping, and storing, overlapped within the same space. The hearth was used to cook meals, but also to heat water for washing, to dry damp clothes, and to bake bread on the hot stones. Near it, baskets or wooden chests stored whatever few possessions the family owned, a precious set of iron tools, a handful of ceramic bowls, perhaps a wooden spoon worn smooth by decades of use. The walls might be hung with cured meats or bunches of herbs drying in the smoky air. A spindle and loom could rest against one side, for weaving cloth was not a craft reserved only for professionals, it was part of daily survival. But what made the peasant home most striking was not just what it contained, but how little separation it offered between people and animals. In many cottages, a corner was set aside for livestock, a tethered cow, a pair of goats, perhaps a few chickens scratching in the dirt. Sometimes a low wooden partition marked the boundary, sometimes there was no division at all. The animals lived under the same roof, their presence woven into the daily rhythms of the household. By day they were sources of labor and food, by night they became companions in the struggle against cold and danger. The smell of such a home was intense, and it clung to everything. The mingling scents of smoke, sweat, manure, and damp straw created an atmosphere, unlike any modern dwelling. To our senses conditioned to seek cleanliness and order, it might seem unbearable. But for the medieval peasant, this was the fragrance of life itself, the smell of survival, of earth and fire, of the animals upon which their families depended. Sound, too, was ever present. The crackle of the hearth, the lowing of cattle, the shuffle of feet across dirt floors, the cries of infants, the murmur of prayers spoken at nightfall, all combined into a chorus of domestic life. Privacy was non-existent. Every cough, every whispered word, every restless movement during the night was shared by all who lived under the roof. Children learned to fall asleep to the noises of their parents at work, and parents learned to rest despite the shifting of animals only feet away. To us this might seem suffocating, even dehumanizing, but for the peasant family, the closeness was a source of comfort as much as inconvenience. The home was not a private retreat, but a communal shelter. Its strength lay in togetherness. To gather in a single room meant not only sharing space but sharing lives, with each breath of smoke-filled air, reminding them that they were part of something larger than themselves, a family, a village, a fragile web of survival. It is easy for us to view such a dwelling through the lens of hardship alone, to see only poverty and discomfort. Yet we must also imagine the warmth of that one-room home on a winter night, the glow of the hearth casting flickering shadows against the walls, the sound of children drifting into sleep, their faces softened by firelight, the steady presence of animals shifting in the straw, their warmth seeping into the air, the murmur of voices telling stories, or reciting prayers to ward off evil. For all its hardships, the peasant home was also a place of resilience, of enduring bonds, of life clinging stubbornly to the edges of comfort. And it is within this modest, smoky, crowded space that the story of peasants sleeping with animals becomes clear, for the home itself demanded it. Its walls were too thin to shut out the cold, its hearth too small to warm the whole family through the night, its security too fragile to stand against the dangers outside. The only true strength it offered lay in what was gathered inside: people, animals, fire, and faith. These were the foundations of the peasant home. When we stand in imagination within those low walls, when we breathe the smoke and feel the rough earth beneath our feet, we begin to understand. The peasant home was no palace, no place of comfort, as we know it today, but it was a world entire, fragile, imperfect and alive with necessity. And it is here, in this humble cottage, that we must continue our journey to see how the rhythms of daily life, and the closeness of humans and animals, shaped the long nights of the Middle Ages. The rhythm of peasant life was inseparably bound to the seasons, and no season was more feared, more relentless than winter. Today, when the temperature drops, we close windows, draw curtains, and turn on heaters that can banish the chill within moments. But for the medieval peasant, there was no such refuge. Cold was a presence that pressed through the thin walls of their homes, seeped into their bones, and lingered for months on end. Winters in medieval Europe were harsh. The so-called Little Ice Age, which began to take hold in the late Middle Ages, brought bitter cold, longer frost, and shorter growing seasons. But even in earlier centuries, winter meant hunger, hardship, and risk. Crops had long been harvested and stored, little fresh food was available. Days were short and filled with work that still had to be done, tending animals, mending tools, hauling water, gathering firewood, and nights. Nights were long, cold, and often unbearable. The hearth was the heart of the peasant home, but it could not always keep out the chill. A small fire, fed by scraps of wood, dried dung, or bundles of straw, might glow brightly in the evening, but fade into embers by midnight. Firewood was precious. It required back-breaking labor to gather or scarce money to purchase. Families rationed it carefully, saving larger logs for the coldest nights, or for cooking rather than burning them freely for comfort. As a result, cottages grew cold soon after the fire dimmed. The air turned damp, breath condensed into white clouds, and frost sometimes crept along the inside of walls. It was in this struggle against the cold that animals became more than possessions. They became partners in survival. The body heat of livestock was not trivial. A cow could radiate warmth like a living furnace. Sheep, goats, and pigs, smaller but numerous, gave off steady heat that filled the enclosed space. Even chickens, huddled together, contributed to raising the temperature of a room, their feathers insulating not only themselves, but the air around them. To sleep near these animals was to draw close to a natural source of heat, one that cost nothing, required no wood, and burned through the night without tending. Imagine a peasant family in the heart of January. The night outside is black, the sky heavy with clouds that threaten snow. The wind whistles through gaps in the thatch, and the door trembles in its frame. Inside, the fire has burned low. Parents and children lie beneath coarse blankets, straw rustling beneath them, yet still the cold bites at their fingers and toes. Then, only feet away, a cow shifts in the straw, its breath rising in clouds of steam. A pig snorts and curls against its companions. Chickens fluff their feathers, tucking heads beneath wings. Slowly the air within the cottage warms, not to comfort, but to survivable levels. It is a fragile warmth, but it is enough. The emotional weight of this arrangement cannot be overstated. For children, animals were not distant creatures, kept outside in barns. They were nightly companions. The sound of their breathing became as familiar as the voices of parents. The smells, pungent and earthy, were part of life itself, and the warmth they shared was a gift silently given, without which many families would have faced frostbite, illness, or even death. Cold was not simply a matter of comfort, it was dangerous. Exposure weakened the body, making it more susceptible to disease. Respiratory illnesses, fevers, and lingering coughs often worsened in the damp chill of winter nights. A child too cold to sleep might fall sick and fail to recover. An elderly parent, shivering in the corner, might not survive until spring. Warmth, then, was not luxury, it was life itself. But this closeness also shaped relationships. To us it may seem strange or unpleasant to imagine animals sharing the same room, perhaps even the same floor space, as humans. Yet for peasants, the warmth of animals blurred the boundary between beast and household member. These were creatures upon which survival depended. Their milk, their wool, their eggs, their labor in the fields, all sustained the family. At night they gave something less tangible, but no less vital, the heat of their bodies. Consider, too, the psychological comfort this offered. Winter was not only a season of physical hardship, but also of emotional strain. Days were shorter, work more difficult, food scarcer, nights stretched on endlessly, filled with the groaning of winds, the howls of wolves, or the unsettling silence of snow. In such times, the soft presence of animals must have been reassuring. A cow's low breathing, steady and calm, was a reminder that life endured even in the heart of winter. The rustle of feathers, the shuffle of hooves, the occasional grunt or bleat, these were signs of continuity, of the fragile but ongoing rhythm of existence. Folklore, too, reflects this closeness. In many parts of Europe, stories told of animals who could speak at midnight on Christmas Eve, a magical reward for their long companionship with humans. Others spoke of cows kneeling in reverence when the church bells rang, Such tales reveal a culture that, while recognizing animals as property, also felt their presence in a more intimate way, as beings who shared in the mysteries of life, death, and survival. To modern ears, the idea of sleeping beside livestock may conjure images of filth or discomfort, and indeed, it was not without its drawbacks: fleas, odors, restless nights. But when weighed against the perils of freezing nights and unrelenting winters, the choice was no choice at all. Animals were warmth, and warmth was survival. The memory of that warmth, shared in countless cottages across centuries, forms the foundation of why peasants accepted such living conditions without complaint. For them, the night was not endured alone. It was endured together, human and animal, family and flock, pressed against the cold darkness outside. And as dawn finally broke, spilling light across frosted fields, it was not just the family that rose to face the day. The animals, too, stood stretched and moved, their breath steaming in the morning air, their presence once again a reminder of the fragile balance between survival and loss. The warmth they had given through the night was invisible, intangible, and yet it was the reason so many peasants could rise at all. This was the unspoken pact of medieval life. When the fire failed, and the winds howled, warmth was drawn not from brick, coal, or machinery, but from the living creatures that shared the home. And in that warmth, peasants found not comfort, but endurance, the fragile thread that tied them through the coldest of nights until spring returned once more. If there was one feature that defined the medieval peasant's home, it was the hearth, set at the center of the single room, often little more than a circle of stones with a fire smoldering inside. It was both practical and symbolic. It cooked food, provided light, and drove back the darkness. But it was more than that. The hearth was the heart of the household, a sacred space where life itself was preserved. And around it, people and animals gathered, not out of preference, but because necessity demanded it. In a one-room cottage, the fire was the dividing line between survival and despair. When flames flickered high, the family felt secure. The fire dried damp clothes, warmed chilled bones, and cast a glow that pushed the shadows into the corners. Yet fuel was scarce. Most peasants had no steady access to large supplies of firewood. Forests were often controlled by landlords or the church, and peasants were forbidden from cutting trees without permission. What wood they gathered, legally or illegally, had to be used sparingly. More often, the fire was fed with smaller twigs, branches, peat, or dried animal dung. These fuels burned quickly and gave off little sustained heat. A fire that roared in the evening might be a bed of weak embers by midnight. Because of this fragility, the hearth was treated with reverence. Families would carefully bank the fire before sleep, covering the embers with ash to preserve their heat until morning. To let a fire die completely was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Restarting it was laborious, requiring sparks struck from flint and steel, or coals borrowed from a neighbor. In some villages, fire sharing itself became a communal ritual, a reminder that survival was collective rather than individual. Within this one-room space, the hearth became the natural gathering point. There were no kitchens separate from living rooms, no dining areas away from sleeping quarters. All life radiated outward from the same center. In the day, meals were prepared here, pots hanging on iron hooks over the flames, or set upon stones at the edge. In the evening, children played in the warmth while parents mended tools or spun wool, and at night, everyone drew close, curling into sleep with their heads or bodies angled toward the last traces of heat. The single-room structure made this closeness unavoidable. Space was too limited for separation. A family might number 6, 8, or even more souls, yet all of them would occupy the same compact dwelling. Beds, as distinct furniture, were rare. Instead, straw-filled mattresses, or plain pallets were laid near the fire. Older family members, infants, and anyone weakened by illness would be placed closest to the hearth, where warmth was strongest. Others would spread out farther, while still remaining within reach of the fire's glow. It was into this arrangement that animals were woven. A cow might be tethered just beyond the family's bedding, a goat secured in a corner, a pen of chickens tucked against a wall. They were not simply tolerated, they were part of the system. The animals' warmth added to the fire's heat. Their bodies helped moderate the bitter chill that pressed through the cracks in the walls. In some homes, animals even occupied the half of the cottage opposite the hearth, creating a balance, humans on one side, beasts on the other, with the sacred fire standing between them. This image of man, beast, and flame sharing the same confined space speaks volumes about the medieval relationship to survival. For the peasant, there was no neat boundary between what belonged inside and what belonged outside. Life flowed together. The hearth smoke blackened rafters above human heads and animal backs alike. Sparks sometimes startled a cow or singed a pig's coarse hair. Children fell asleep listening not only to the crackle of burning wood, but to the shuffling and breathing of the creatures that sustained their families. The symbolic weight of the hearth only deepened this arrangement. Across Europe, the hearth was viewed as sacred. To extinguish a household fire was to invite misfortune. In some traditions, prayers were murmured when banking the flames for the night. In others, saints were invoked to guard against chimney fires, or to bless the smoke rising toward heaven. For the poorest peasants who owned little else, the hearth was their altar. It was the place where bread was baked, where warmth was shared, where stories were told. It was a thread of light, binding them to both the divine and the mundane. And yet, the reality remained stark. The fire could not be relied upon to carry a family through the whole night. As it dimmed, the cold crept closer. Blankets were thin, clothing coarse. This is where the presence of animals became vital. The fire offered a burst of warmth, but the animals gave a steady heat, hour after hour, as long as they lived. Together, fire and beast created a fragile balance that allowed peasants to endure the endless nights of winter. It is easy to overlook how radical this arrangement was. To us, a home is defined by boundaries: bedrooms separate from kitchens, kitchens distinct from barns, barns far from the spaces where families sleep. But for the peasant, everything was compressed into one smoky, crowded room. Here children played, meals cooked, tools repaired, stories told, prayers spoken, animals tethered, and finally, sleep found. The single-room home was not just small, it was all-encompassing. The hearth tied it together. It stood at the crossroads of necessity and symbolism, providing both the heat that made survival possible and the sacred center that gave meaning to daily life. Without it, the home was nothing but a shell. With it, even the most meager cottage could be transformed into a place of endurance. And so, when peasants lay down at night, they did so not in silence or solitude, but in a living tapestry of warmth, breath, smoke, and sound. Parents whispered lullabies to children. The fire hissed and sighed as embers crumbled. A goat shifted its hooves in the straw. A cow exhaled softly, its breath hanging in the cold air. Above them, the rafters creaked. Outside, the wind roared. But within that fragile room, human and animal body and flame, they made it through the night. To us, this may appear primitive, even bleak, but to them it was life itself. It was the fragile shield that kept darkness at bay, the sacred bond between people and the creatures they depended upon, the glowing center of a world otherwise swallowed by cold and fear. The hearth and the single room were not merely features of architecture, they were the essence of medieval peasant existence, the fire that bound them together against the night. In the medieval countryside, the fall of night was more than a descent into cold and darkness. It was the moment when dangers grew bolder. During daylight, the fields and paths were alive with work, chatter, and watchful eyes. But when the sun sank, and the firelight in cottages dimmed, peasants knew the world outside was no longer theirs. The dark belonged to prowlers, both human and animal, and only vigilance could keep a household safe. It is here that the presence of animals took on another dimension. They were not merely companions for warmth or providers of food. They were guardians, watchful eyes and ears, in a world where every sound carried hidden meaning. A home without animals was not only colder, but more vulnerable, for animals were the first line of defense against the perils of the night. The threats were real. Wolves still roamed much of Europe, especially in forests and borderlands, where villages were sparse. They could snatch a sheep or goat in moments, and in desperate times, even threaten children. Bears lingered in some regions, drawn by the scent of food. Wild boars, fierce and unpredictable, sometimes approached settlements, but even more constant than wild beasts were the dangers posed by desperate men. Bandits, thieves, and hungry wanderers knew that peasants had little, but that little often meant survival: a sack of grain, a fattened pig, a cow heavy with milk. To steal such things was to rob a family not just of wealth, but of life itself. Against such dangers, walls of wattle and daub offered little. Doors barred with wooden beams could be forced open. Windows, when they existed at all, were small, shuttered holes. Locks, if present, were simple and easily broken. True protection came not from barriers of wood or earth, but from living sentinels who shared the peasant's dwelling. Dogs were the most obvious guardians. Even the poorest families tried to keep one, not for affection in the modern sense, but for service. A dog's bark could pierce the silence of night, warning its masters of movement outside. Its growl could startle an intruder before they reached the door. Tales from medieval chronicles speak of dogs leaping to defend their owners, or alerting whole villages to raiders before disaster struck. To sleep with a dog nearby was to rest with a vigilant watchman who asked for nothing but scraps of food in return. But other animals too played unexpected roles as protectors. Geese, for instance, were prized not only for their meat and feathers, but for their keen senses. They honked loudly at the slightest disturbance, often more quickly than dogs. Some households relied on geese as living alarms, their cries carrying across the night air to rouse neighbors and frighten intruders. Chickens clucked and fluttered when disturbed, pigs squealed with astonishing volume, and cows stirred uneasily when strangers approached. Each animal had its own way of signaling danger, and peasants learned to interpret these cues as carefully as we read signs and symbols today. Consider the scene: a family lies sleeping near the hearth, the fire a bed of faint embers. Outside, footsteps crunch softly on frozen earth. A thief edges toward the cottage, hoping to slip away with a hen or a sack of grain. But inside, a goose stirs, lifts its head, and unleashes a shrill cry. A dog leaps up, barking wildly. The family wakes, voices rise, and the intruder, startled and exposed, flees back into the darkness. In this way, animals were not just resources, they were guardians of the fragile line between safety and ruin. This protective presence shaped the peasant's sense of trust in their creatures. They were not sentimental companions, yet their reliability was deeply valued. A cow that stirred when wolves prowled near, a dog that barked at a stranger's step, a goose that sounded the alarm. These were more than coincidences. They were lifelines. Survival was not only about food and warmth, but about knowing when danger approached, and peasants leaned on their animals for this invisible service. The protective bond extended beyond practical defense into the realm of symbolism. In folklore, animals were often linked to vigilance and loyalty. Dogs were seen as faithful guardians, their loyalty praised in both song and story. Roosters were celebrated for heralding the dawn, chasing away spirits of the night with their crowing. Even the lowly goose found its place in legend, remembered in tales of villages saved by their timely alarm. Such stories reflected lived experience, born from countless nights when animal cries had meant the difference between disaster and safety. It is important to understand that peasants did not live in constant terror. Though danger was real, so too was resilience. The sounds of animals at night, the bark, the cluck, the shuffle, were both warning and reassurance. They reminded families that their home was not silent, not unguarded. To fall asleep amid these noises was not always restful, but it was safer than silence. Silence in the medieval imagination meant absence. Absence of fire, absence of life, absence of protection. Noise, however chaotic, meant presence, and presence was survival. This guardianship also deepened the interdependence between humans and animals. A peasant might feed scraps to a dog, not only out of obligation, but out of gratitude. A goose kept alive through winter might seem a burden, but when its cry saved a household from theft, it proved its worth beyond measure. Even creatures destined for slaughter or sale could serve as protectors in the meantime. Their lives intertwined with the human family, not only through labor and sustenance, but through the nightly act of guarding what little they all possessed. Thus the peasant household was never truly alone in the face of night. Human eyes closed in sleep, but animal senses remained awake. Together they formed a network of awareness, each creature adding its own layer of vigilance to the fragile safety of the home. The dogs bark, the geese honk, the pigs squeal, the cows stir. These were the alarms of medieval life, more reliable than locks or walls and far more immediate. And so, as the embers of the hearth glowed faintly, and shadows pressed against the walls, peasants rested not in silence, but in a symphony of guardianship. Their homes were fragile, their possessions few, their defenses weak, yet with animals at their side, they endured. For in the darkness, survival depended not only on warmth, but on warning, and in this the creatures they lived beside became their truest protectors. For the medieval peasant, survival was not only about enduring each day, but about managing the fragile balance of resources that kept hunger and ruin at bay. In this balance, animals played a role far more significant than modern readers might imagine. To us, a cow, a goat, or a flock of chickens may seem like humble creatures, but in the life of a medieval family, they were treasure, bank account, insurance policy, and lifeline, all at once. The economy of survival revolved around them, and their presence in the home at night was not only practical, but profoundly economic. Imagine a peasant family's yearly cycle. Their fields might yield barley, rye, oats, or wheat, depending on the region, but harvests were uncertain. Drought, floods, frost, or pests could ruin a crop. Grain stored in barns was vulnerable to rot or theft, and while bread was the foundation of diet, it could not alone sustain a household. That role fell to animals, whose constant presence provided a steady supply of milk, eggs, wool, manure, on rare occasions, meat. The cow, in particular, was perhaps the most valuable creature a peasant could own. More than its size or strength, its daily gift of milk made it indispensable. From milk came butter, cheese, curds, and cream, foods that lasted longer and offered vital protein and fat. A cow could turn grass, inedible to humans, into nourishment that kept children alive through harsh winters. To lose a cow was to lose more than food, it meant losing security. Without one, families were forced into dependence on neighbors or risky purchases at the market, draining away what little silver they might possess. Goats, smaller but equally vital, were often called the poor man's cow, hardy and able to graze on rough land where cattle could not. Goats produced milk rich in nutrients and were easier to shelter in the home. Their mischievous energy may have tried the patience of their owners, but their adaptability ensured their place at the heart of peasant survival. Sheep offered another form of wealth. While their milk could be used for cheese, their true value lay in wool. Wool was warmth spun into thread, woven into cloth, and shaped into garments that guarded against the bitter cold. A family's flock, even if small, might provide enough material to clothe them through the seasons, and sometimes surplus wool could be sold or traded, bringing in precious coin. In regions where markets flourished, sheep became the backbone of local economies, tying even humble peasants to the great web of medieval trade. Pigs, meanwhile, were walking larders, fed on scraps, acorns, and whatever forage they could find. They grew quickly and fattened well. To slaughter a pig in late autumn was to secure meat for the months of scarcity ahead. Salted, smoked, or preserved in fat, pork became the sustaining flesh that carried families through the lean days of Lent and the bitter depths of winter. Every part of the pig was used: meat for meals, fat for cooking, hides for leather, bristles for brushes. Pigs, noisy and restless though they were, symbolized abundance when times were good. Even the humble chicken played a crucial role. Their eggs provided small but steady nourishment, their feathers filled bedding, and when they grew too old to lay, their bodies supplied meat. Geese, as mentioned earlier, were valuable not only for alarm, but also for feathers, down, and rich meat. In an age when every resource counted, even the smallest animal made a difference in whether families thrived or merely endured. The economic bond between peasants and their animals was therefore deeply practical, but it also shaped daily habits and choices. At night, animals were often brought indoors, not simply for warmth or protection from predators, but because they represented concentrated wealth. To leave a cow outside was to risk losing the family's fortune. To neglect the safety of pigs or chickens was to endanger months of food. Bringing them into the home was the equivalent of locking up treasure in a chest. The barnyard became the vault, and the peasant's cottage, though humble, became a fortress of survival. This interdependence extended to the way families measured prosperity. A man might be judged not only by the land he tilled, but by the animals he kept. A dowry could include livestock, securing a woman's marriage not only with coin, but with cows or sheep. A widow's rights often included the retention of certain animals, ensuring she could provide for herself and her children. Disputes over animals appear frequently in medieval records, testifying to their central role in community life. Markets and fairs further amplified this importance. When peasants traveled to sell butter, cheese, wool, or eggs, they were participating in a vast network of trade that stretched far beyond their village. A cow's milk might not only feed a family, but generate surplus to sell, earning enough pennies to buy salt, tools, or cloth. A goose sold at market might pay the rent due to a lord. In this way, animals linked the peasant's cottage to the larger economic fabric of medieval society. Yet the economic role of animals was always precarious. Disease could sweep through herds, destroying wealth overnight. Famine could reduce feed, forcing peasants to slaughter animals early, weakening their long-term survival. Lords might demand rents or tithes in livestock, stripping families of their most precious possessions. The vulnerability of peasants was never far from view, and their animals stood at the heart of this fragile balance. One must imagine the emotional weight of this dependency. A family might not see animals as pets in the modern sense, yet they surely felt attachment born of reliance. The cow that gave milk daily, the sheep that clothed children, the pig that promised winter meat, these creatures were bound to human survival in ways that inspired gratitude, care, and perhaps quiet affection. Medieval texts often speak of animals in utilitarian terms, but the lived reality must have been more nuanced. To watch a cow grow ill, to lose a pig to thieves, or to hear wolves take a sheep, was not just an economic blow, but an emotional wound, a fracture in the fragile hope that tomorrow would be secure. And so peasants slept beside their animals, not only to share warmth, not only for guardianship, but because those animals were their wealth, their life insurance, their survival made flesh. To hear the breathing of a cow in the dark, to feel the restless shifting of a pig, to wake to the crow of a rooster, these were reminders that one's treasure was close, safe, and alive. The economy of survival was not built on coins jingling in purses or jewels locked in chests, but on the humble sounds and smells of animals in the home. This economy was measured in milk poured into wooden bowls, in wool spun on the spindle, in eggs cracked into morning porridge. It was a wealth that lived and breathed, dependent on human care, yet endlessly giving in return. In the silence of night, when the fire burned low and hunger lurked at the edge of memory, peasants rested in the company of their most precious possessions. They did not count gold before sleep, but instead listened for the steady lowing of a cow, the gentle rustle of sheep, the muffled cluck of hens. These were the sounds of security, the economy of survival that bound them to life itself. For medieval peasants, life was never simply about the material world. Every moment, every choice, and every hardship was framed by an unseen layer of belief, a world where the sacred mingled with the superstitious, and where animals, so close to daily existence, were thought to carry powers, omens, and spiritual significance. To sleep in the same room as animals was, therefore, not only an act of necessity, but also one shaped by centuries of faith, fear, and folklore. The medieval mind was steeped in symbolism. The cow was not merely a source of milk, but a creature with connections to biblical imagery, fertility, and divine providence. To possess a healthy cow was a sign of God's favor, while the sudden illness of livestock could be interpreted as punishment, witchcraft, or a warning of darker things to come. It was believed that animals, being closer to the earth and to nature, could sense forces that humans could not, spirits wandering in the night, storms on the horizon, or even the presence of death itself. Superstition made its way into the most ordinary routines. A rooster crowing at midnight, rather than at dawn, was thought to herald misfortune, perhaps even a death in the household. The restless stamping of a cow might mean that evil spirits were near. A dog, howling in the distance, was a sign that the souls of the departed were on the move. To peasants living in cottages, dimly lit, and surrounded by forests or moors, such signs were not dismissed lightly. They were woven into the rhythm of life, forming part of the peasant's nightly experience, as surely as the crackling of the fire or the breathing of their companions. Sleeping beside animals, therefore, brought both comfort and unease. On one hand, their presence symbolized protection. The rooster, for example, was thought to ward off demons, its crowing announcing the coming of dawn and driving away darkness. Cats, too, played a complicated role, admired for their ability to hunt vermin, but often feared for their association with witchcraft and the devil. A cat's sudden stare or nighttime cry might unsettle a household, raising fears of curses or malevolent powers. The church, which guided much of medieval thought, reinforced and sometimes reshaped these associations. Preachers often drew on animal imagery to illustrate lessons about virtue and sin. The sheep was praised as a symbol of innocence and obedience, while the goat was condemned as stubborn and associated with the damned. Pigs, too, were linked to gluttony and impurity, while the faithful ox and humble donkey were remembered as companions at Christ's nativity. These layers of meaning transformed the animals in the peasant's home into living reminders of moral lessons, whether comforting or cautionary. Yet local folklore could override even the church's teachings. In some regions, it was believed that cows possessed a sacred aura, able to sense witches and protect households from their malice. A charm tied around a cow's neck might serve not only to protect the animal, but also to shield the family from harm. Horses, though less common in poor cottages, were said to be ridden by spirits at night, their tangled manes proof of nocturnal journeys into the other world. Chickens, when sacrificed in certain rituals, were thought to reveal the future by the way their bodies fell. This blending of superstition and spirituality reveals just how deeply animals were woven into the medieval imagination. For peasants, survival was precarious, and in the absence of scientific explanations, meaning was drawn from signs, symbols, and patterns. Animals, being ever present, naturally became conduits for these beliefs. Their behavior, health, and very presence were interpreted as messages from the divine or warnings from darker forces. Consider the nightly scene once more. A family lies down in the dim light, children drifting into slumber, parents weary from toil. A cow shifts heavily in the corner, her breath misting in the cold air. For the family, this sound is not only the reassurance of food for tomorrow, but also a reminder of divine providence, a living gift entrusted to their care. Nearby, a rooster may stir, his feathers rustling, a guardian against evil. A pig grunts in its sleep, and though its presence is humble, its abundance suggests future security. Yet should a strange sound break the silence, a sudden howl from a dog outside, a rooster's crow too early, or the unblinking gaze of a cat, unease would ripple through the household. Such signs were never ignored. It was not uncommon for prayers and blessings to be spoken over animals before bed. Families might recite the Lord's Prayer while crossing themselves and by extension their animals. Holy water sprinkled on livestock could guard against sickness, while charms, sometimes sanctioned by the church, sometimes rooted in older pagan traditions, might hang above doors or from rafters, ensuring that no evil could enter the threshold. In this way, the act of sharing space with animals was also an act of shared protection, where faith and superstition coexisted in the same smoky air. This world of belief also meant that the death of an animal carried symbolic weight. The sudden loss of a cow might not be seen merely as misfortune, but as a curse or omen of death to come. A pig struck down by disease could lead to fears that the household itself was spiritually unclean. In such times, peasants often turned to both the church and local wise women, seeking prayers, charms, or rituals to restore balance. Animals in life and death acted as bridges between the material and the spiritual. What modern minds might dismiss as superstition was, for medieval people, a logical framework for interpreting the mysteries of existence. In the absence of certainty, meaning was found in patterns. Animals sharing the same roof became daily companions in this search for meaning, their actions loaded with significance far beyond their practical roles. To live with them was not only to share space, but to share in a world of signs, where every sound, every movement, might whisper truths about the future. Thus, when peasants slept in the same room as animals, they were not simply bundling close for warmth or guarding against thieves. They were participating in a deeper, invisible relationship, one in which survival, spirituality, and superstition intertwined. Their nights were filled with the sounds of both comfort and warning, their dreams framed by creatures who, in their eyes, stood half in this world and half in another. In the medieval world, no peasant family lived entirely by its own will. Every hut, every field, every cow and pig sleeping in the dark corner of a cottage ultimately existed under the shadow of a lord's authority. The great framework of feudalism bound peasants to their lords in a web of obligations, rents, labor, and taxes that shaped not only their days in the fields, but also their nights beneath the thatched roof. To understand why peasants slept in the same room as their animals, we must see how the hand of the Lord reached even into the intimate, smoky air of the peasant home. The village was the smallest unit of a vast hierarchy. At its center stood the manor, the estate of the Lord, with its fields, its church, its granary, and its network of cottages. The peasants who worked this land were not free in the modern sense of the word. Many were serfs, tied to the soil, bound to serve the Lord, who held ultimate claim over both their labor and their livelihood. The animals in the cottage were not simply possessions of the peasant family. They were also part of the manor's wealth, assets upon which lords depended for rents and dues. Each year, peasants were required to pay their lord, not only in coins, when they had them, but more often in kind. This meant sacks of grain, bundles of wool, baskets of eggs, or the offspring of livestock. A peasant's cow or sheep was not just food or milk for the family. It was a form of currency, a living storehouse of value that could be demanded by the manor at any time. Keeping animals under the same roof was therefore not only practical, but also protective. To lose a cow to theft or disease was to risk being unable to meet one's obligations, to risk falling into debt or punishment. The law reinforced these bonds. In many regions, lords had the right of harriet, a death duty requiring that upon a peasant's passing, his best animal be surrendered to the lord. Imagine the scene: a family grieving by the hearth, their cow or ox taken away as a legal requirement, leaving them poorer and more vulnerable than before. It is no wonder that animals were kept close, watched carefully each night, for they were entangled with the very survival of the household. Beyond taxes, peasants owed labor. Days spent ploughing the lord's fields, repairing roads, or maintaining ditches left them little time to tend their own plots. The animals they owned often worked alongside them in fulfilling these duties. An ox might drag a plough across the manor's land, or a horse, if the family could afford one, might haul timber for the lord's projects. In such a system, an animal was not simply a companion but an extension of the peasant's labor, a partner in obligations imposed from above. To shelter such creatures indoors was a way of guarding the very tools that allowed the family to endure the weight of feudal demands. The authority of the lord extended deep into the rhythms of peasant life. Rules about when and how animals could graze were strictly enforced. Forests, meadows and streams were often declared the lord's property, and peasants could be fined or punished for allowing their pigs or cattle to wander without permission. Common rights, such as access to woodland for foraging or rivers for fishing, were privileges that could be withdrawn at the lord's will. In this world of restrictions, the cottage became a fortress of sorts, a small and fragile domain, where peasants could at least assert some control by keeping their animals within their walls. Yet the relationship between lord and peasant was not solely one of oppression, it was also one of dependency. Lords relied on their peasants to till fields, provide rents, and defend the estate's prosperity. Animals, too, were part of this mutual dependence. The lord's wealth was measured not only in acres of land, but in the herds and flocks kept by his tenants. A thriving village meant a thriving manor, and so, paradoxically, the lord's power to demand and extract was balanced by a need to ensure that peasants could maintain their animals, however humbly, through the long winters. Nevertheless, the system left little room for comfort. A poor harvest, a disease among livestock, or an increase in rents could plunge a family into desperation. When famine struck, lords rarely lifted obligations, and peasants were forced to make impossible choices: feed the children, or save grain for taxes, eat the pig now, or keep it to breed for next year's dues. In such moments, the closeness of animals in the household was a constant reminder of both survival and vulnerability. A pig might squeal in the dark, a cow shift uneasily, and the family would feel in those sounds the weight of obligations looming over them, obligations that might cost them everything, if not fulfilled. The church, closely allied with the feudal order, reinforced this structure with its own teachings. To disobey one's lord was often framed as a sin, a rebellion not only against earthly authority, but against divine will. Priests preached that every man had his station ordained by God, and peasants were reminded to accept their lot with humility. In this way, even the cramped cottage with its beasts became part of a grand, divinely sanctioned design, one where suffering was a test of faith, and endurance promised reward in heaven. Yet within this web of control, peasants found ways to resist quietly. Some hid animals from the lord's reeves and officials, concealing a piglet or lamb in the shadows of the cottage to avoid paying dues. Others exaggerated losses, claiming that wolves had taken a sheep, or that illness had killed a cow, when in truth the animal had been sold or slaughtered in secret. These acts of resistance, small but significant, took place under the very same roofs where animals slept, the closeness between man and beast becoming not just practical but political, a means of defiance against the demands of the powerful. The image of a medieval family, huddled in their cottage with their animals, is thus not merely one of poverty or necessity. It is an image bound to the legal and social structures of the age. Each lowing cow, each clucking hen, each grunting pig carried within it the invisible weight of feudal obligation. To care for them was to meet the expectations of the lord, to lose them was to invite ruin. The walls of the cottage may have been made of mud and straw, but they also enclosed a world of duties, rights and unending vigilance. As night settled over the manor, with the lord resting in his fortified hall, and the priest asleep in his rectory, the peasant family lay down in their smoky hut, the sounds of animals surrounding them. Yet even here, under the same thatch, the authority of the lord was present, shaping the way they lived, the way they worked, and even the way they slept. The peasants may have closed their eyes, but they could never fully escape the obligations that bound them, obligations embodied in the very creatures that shared their bedchamber. Thus the mingling of man and beast under one roof was not only a story of warmth and necessity, but a reflection of a larger system, a reminder that no part of peasant life, not even the privacy of the night, was untouched by the power of lords and laws. To sleep beneath the same roof as animals was to live in a world of constant contact with dirt, odor, and disease. For the medieval peasant, this mingling of human and beast was not simply uncomfortable, it carried hidden dangers that seeped into their bodies, their health, and even their sense of what it meant to be clean. The cottage was not only a shelter, but also a breeding ground, where illness lurked in the very air and straw upon which families lay. In these smoky, crowded rooms, the boundaries between man and beast dissolved. Chickens fluttered across rafters, scattering feathers and droppings onto the floor below. Pigs grunted and rooted in corners, their bodies warm, but their smell pervasive. Cows shifted heavily in the dark, chewing cud and leaving behind great piles of dung. The family, lying only a few feet away, inhaled the same air, slept on the same earthen floor, and shared in the filth that clung to every surface. Hygiene, as we understand it today, was largely absent. Water was fetched from streams or wells, often contaminated by the very animals that drank from them. Washing was minimal, for to strip away the layer of grime and sweat was not always possible, in a world where warmth was scarce and soap a luxury. Baths were rare, sometimes seen only once or twice a year, and many believed excessive washing was unhealthy, opening the pores to disease, rather than preventing it. In this environment, the mingling of people and livestock was not perceived as shocking, but as natural, even inevitable. Yet the risks were real and severe. Animals carried fleas, lice and ticks that easily leapt to human hosts. Rats and mice scurried across floors, drawn by spilled grain and scraps, leaving behind droppings that harbored deadly pathogens. Fleas from rodents would one day carry the bacterium Yersinia pestis, igniting the Black Death that swept across Europe in the 14th century, killing millions. Though peasants of earlier centuries could not have understood the microscopic causes of disease, they lived daily with the conditions that made such plagues possible. Respiratory ailments were common in the peasant cottage. The smoke from the central hearth, with no chimney to draw it away, filled the single room, coating the walls black and clogging the lungs of all who lived there. Children grew up coughing, their eyes stinging from the fumes, their breathing heavy and wheezing, combined with the dust of straw bedding, the dander of animals, and the stench of manure. The cottage was a place where lungs were never clear, and sickness was always close at hand. Skin diseases flourished as well. Mange scabies and ringworm spread easily in households where people and animals shared bedding or close quarters. The scratching of fleas, the bites of lice, and the irritations of mites were so common that they became part of daily life, endured without complaint. Clothing was rarely washed, and straw bedding was seldom changed, meaning that pests bred freely in the warmth of human and animal bodies. For peasants, itching, rashes, and sores were simply part of existence, endured silently as they labored through their days. The danger of zoonotic diseases, illnesses passing from animals to humans, was ever present, though not understood. Milk might carry infections, meat might bring parasites, and close contact with livestock opened countless invisible pathways for sickness. Outbreaks of anthrax, for example, swept through herds and then through human communities, killing both beasts and their caretakers. Rabies, spread through bites, was a dreaded fate, with its terrifying symptoms and inevitable death. To live among animals was to accept not only their warmth and utility, but also the risks they carried in their blood and breath. The perception of cleanliness itself was shaped by these realities. For medieval peasants, clean did not mean free of germs, a concept they could not fathom, but free of visible filth or spiritual corruption. A person might be considered clean if their hands and face were rinsed for Sunday church, even if their body was otherwise unwashed for weeks. Likewise, a cottage might be swept of large piles of manure or refuse, but still remain filled with fleas and thick with smoke. In this way, the medieval idea of cleanliness was less about health and more about order, ritual, and appearance. The church also influenced attitudes toward hygiene. Bathing was sometimes discouraged, associated with vanity, or even sin. Monks in some orders avoided bathing frequently, believing it distracted from spiritual focus. Ordinary peasants followed similar patterns, washing rarely and relying instead on prayer, charms, or blessings to protect them from illness. When sickness struck, it was often seen as the will of God, a punishment for sin, or a trial of faith, rather than the result of invisible creatures, carried by rats or fleas. Still, peasants were not entirely ignorant of cause and effect. They noticed that foul smells were often linked with sickness, giving rise to the theory of miasma, the belief that bad air caused disease. This led some families to burn herbs, scatter rushes on floors, or hang fragrant plants in cottages to ward off illness. While ineffective against most infections, these practices offered comfort and a sense of control in a world where true understanding of disease was centuries away. Despite the filth and the risks, life endured. Children grew up in these cottages, playing among the animals, learning to care for them, and sharing in their warmth. Families accepted sickness as part of the natural order, a shadow that hovered constantly over their lives. They did not expect to be free from illness, rather they sought only to survive it long enough to raise children, harvest fields, and meet the obligations of their lords. And yet within this grim reality, there was resilience. Peasants developed strong constitutions, hardened by constant exposure to dirt and disease. Their bodies adapted to the environment, building resistance where they could, even if mortality remained high. Death was familiar, but so too was endurance. The same conditions that spread illness also created communities bound tightly together by necessity, families who shared not only burdens but also care, nursing one another through fevers, wounds and coughs as best they could. Thus the peasant cottage was both a sanctuary and a hazard, a place where life was nurtured and imperiled in equal measure. The closeness of animals brought warmth and survival, but also pests and plague. The smoky air sustained the fire of life, but choked the lungs of those who breathed it. To modern eyes, such a world seems unbearably harsh, but to those who lived within it, it was simply the fabric of existence. They did not dwell on what could not be changed. Instead, they endured night after night, in cottages where the lowing of cows, the clucking of hens, and the laughter of children mingled with the ever-present shadow of disease. In the dim, flickering light of a medieval cottage, the presence of animals was more than physical. It was spiritual, symbolic, and deeply entwined with the peasant imagination. Faith and superstition wove together into a tapestry that shaped every waking and sleeping moment. To sleep in the same room as animals was not simply an act of practicality, it was a nightly ritual steeped in meaning, a quiet negotiation between the natural and supernatural worlds. The church was the axis around which much medieval thought revolved. Even in the humblest cottages, priests taught that God created all creatures, assigning each a purpose within the divine plan. Sheep symbolized innocence and obedience, reflecting the faithful life of a Christian. Oxen embodied patience and strength, mirroring the virtues expected of a peasant. Pigs, often scorned for their gluttony, reminded humans of vice and sin. Even chickens and geese carried symbolic weight. Their crowing and honking were seen as both omens and protective signals, bridging the mundane and the sacred. Yet peasant belief extended far beyond formal religion. Folk traditions, often passed down orally through generations, imbued animals with powers both protective and dangerous. A rooster's crow at midnight might ward off malevolent spirits. A cat's piercing stare could be a sign of witchcraft nearby. Even a dog's restless movement could indicate an unseen threat. These signs were never taken lightly. They were interpreted, acted upon, and often formed the rhythm of daily life. To share space with animals was to live within a network of spiritual signals, each creature a sentry in the unseen realm as well as the seen. Certain animals were particularly charged with supernatural significance. Black cats, for instance, were associated with witchcraft and the devil, yet they were also believed by some to offer protection when properly respected. Geese, beyond their practical value, were thought to possess keen senses that allowed them to detect intruders or spirits. The lowing of a cow or the whinny of a horse could carry messages from the divine or warnings of approaching misfortune. In this way, the nocturnal sounds of the household were more than background noise. They were interpreted as communication between humans and the wider mysterious world. Superstition intertwined with faith in subtle ways. Peasants might bless their animals with holy water, cross themselves over the sleeping cow, or recite prayers while tending their chickens, believing that such acts ensured divine favor and protection. Conversely, the sudden death or illness of an animal might be seen as a warning or a curse, prompting consultation with a local wise woman, prayers at the altar, or offerings to saints. Every movement, every sound, every small mishap carried potential significance, blurring the line between the practical and the spiritual. The timing of actions also held symbolic weight. Night was a liminal time, a boundary between the known and unknown. Darkness brought fear, but also reverence. To fall asleep beside animals during this period was to acknowledge their dual role as guardians of the body and interpreters of the unseen. A child waking to the crow of a rooster, or the stir of a cow, might be startled, but such signs were also reassuring, a reminder that unseen forces were neither absent nor indifferent. Certain festivals and rituals further reinforced the spiritual value of animals. During harvest festivals, animals were blessed to ensure future fertility and productivity. Saint days often involved prayers for livestock, tying the rhythms of faith to the practical work of survival. A household that treated its animals with care, respecting both their needs and the spiritual significance assigned to them, was believed to enjoy greater protection, abundance, and divine favor. Folk stories and fairy tales reinforced these beliefs, often teaching lessons through the actions of animals. Tales of clever foxes, loyal dogs, or prophetic birds circulated widely, blurring the boundary between entertainment and moral instruction. To live intimately with animals was to be constantly reminded of these lessons. Loyalty, vigilance, courage, and cunning were qualities reflected in the creatures themselves and in their human caretakers. This symbolic framework influenced the design and arrangement of peasant cottages. Animals were often placed in corners near the hearth or close to sleeping areas, not only for warmth or safety, but for their spiritual utility. A cow by the hearth radiated sustenance and protection. A dog near the door stood guard against both earthly and spiritual intruders. Even the lowly chicken, moving through the straw, was integrated into this network of protection and symbolism. The cottage became a microcosm, where survival, belief, and ritual coexisted in fragile harmony. Moreover, animals often served as silent witnesses to human emotions, fears, and hopes. Their presence during childbirth, for instance, or in times of grief, carried both practical and symbolic weight. A cow's steady breathing, a dog's vigilant watch, or a goose's alarm could comfort the anxious, lend courage to the fearful, and signal the benevolence of divine providence. In this way, animals were not only physical companions but also participants in the spiritual life of the household, anchoring human experience in a wider, meaningful world. Even the most mundane acts, feeding, cleaning, stroking an animal, became imbued with spiritual resonance. To care for an animal was to participate in God's creation, to honor the life granted to each creature, and to ensure the family's continued protection. Peasants lived intimately with their animals not out of mere habit, but with a profound recognition of their dual role: providers of warmth and sustenance, and intermediaries in a world where the seen and unseen were intertwined. In essence, the medieval peasant cottage was a sacred space, however humble. Its walls, built of wattle and daubin, enclosed more than people and livestock. They enclosed a living ritual of faith, superstition, and symbolic interaction. Each night, as firelight flickered on smoky beams and shadows danced across straw floors, the cohabitation of human and animal was both practical and transcendent. Together they created a rhythm of life that connected survival with the divine, comfort with caution, and daily labor with the mysteries of the unseen world. Thus, to sleep in the same room as animals was not merely an economic or practical necessity. It was an act of engagement with forces larger than the human body. The warmth of a cow, the vigilance of a dog, the crow of a rooster, all became woven into a tapestry of meaning, guiding the peasant through the night with protection, insight, and spiritual resonance. In every breath shared with an animal, in every sound of movement or lowing, the medieval household experienced a profound connection to life, survival, and the unseen currents that shaped their world. The life of a medieval peasant was intimately bound to the rhythms of the seasons. Each year unfolded like a living calendar, where planting, harvesting, and tending livestock dictated every waking moment. But these seasonal patterns did not end with the setting sun. They extended into the night, shaping the way families coexisted with their animals. To understand why peasants slept in the same room as cows, pigs, or chickens, one must see the subtle choreography of labor, climate, and survival that defined every evening, every week, and every year. Spring arrived as a season of hope and preparation. Fields, long resting beneath snow and frost, demanded careful tending. The peasant family rose before dawn, guiding oxen to plow the softened soil, scattering seeds by hand, and returning home at dusk, exhausted. Evenings were brief, and yet vital chores persisted after dark. Livestock, vital to both survival and income, needed feeding, watering, and observation. The cow brought in from pasture, as the night chill settled, required bedding and care. Chickens were counted, coops secured, and young animals checked for illness or injury. Only once these routines were complete could the family finally rest. Summer brought longer days, yet work remained relentless. Hay needed cutting, grain needed tending, and the risk of predators increased as wolves and foxes roamed under the cover of dusk. Animals were not left alone in distant pens. Their survival depended on proximity to human watchfulness. Nights were punctuated by the sounds of these creatures settling in, the lowing of cows, the clucking of hens, the soft grunts of pigs, each a reassurance that work had been done correctly and that resources were secured. The rhythms of sleep adjusted accordingly. Parents rose and moved quietly to check the animals. Children learned early to listen for signs of trouble, and the cottage became a space where human and animal schedules intertwined seamlessly. Autumn was a season of preparation and anxiety. Harvests had to be gathered, stored, and protected. Grain needed drying and winnowing, and animals had to be fattened for the lean months ahead. The cottage became a hub of activity after sunset. Pigs were herded indoors, their pens cleaned and lined with straw. Chickens were secured to prevent theft or predation. Cows were brushed and milked, their milk stored in wooden containers, ready for butter or cheese production. In this period, the proximity of animals to humans was not optional, it was a strategy for survival. A single lost animal could mean the difference between abundance and scarcity in the coming winter. Winter imposed the harshest rhythms, snow covered fields and pastures, frost stiffened the ground, and nights stretched long and bitterly cold. The warmth of animals became essential, providing heat in cottages with poorly insulated walls and only a central hearth. Sleeping beside a cow, a pig, or a few chickens was a practical choice. The heat of their bodies shared a limited enclosed space, making the freezing nights more bearable. The chores of winter were fewer in quantity, but heavier in consequence. Feed had to be rationed carefully, water drawn from wells that might be frozen, and constant vigilance maintained to protect both human and animal lives from the cold. Daily routines followed a consistent pattern, shaped by these seasonal needs. Before sunset, animals were gathered and secured. Milking, feeding, and inspection were performed methodically, often in silence, to avoid startling the livestock. Children were taught to help quietly, carrying small buckets of water or straw, learning the delicate art of moving among large, restless creatures. After chores, the family would eat a simple meal, often consisting of porridge, bread, or preserved vegetables, their thoughts turning to rest. Only after all these duties were complete could they finally settle down for the night, sharing the space with the very beings that ensured their survival. Even the arrangement of sleeping spaces reflected the seasonal and daily rhythms. In summer, when warmth was less critical, animals might be grouped near the edge of the room or in slightly separate pens. In winter, they were brought as close to the hearth as possible, maximizing shared heat. Straw was layered thickly, both for insulation and for comfort, creating a soft bed for both human and animal alike. These arrangements were carefully monitored, adjusted according to weather, animal behavior, and the changing demands of each season. Nighttime routines also carried symbolic and protective elements. Firelight flickered against walls, casting shadows that seemed to dance across the straw and animal bodies. Parents often recited prayers or blessings before sleep, including the animals in their invocation. A cow might be crossed with holy water, a dog stroked and murmured over, a rooster checked for signs of illness. The rhythms of work, protection, and spirituality intertwined seamlessly, a quiet choreography, repeated night after night, year after year. Seasonal festivals further punctuated these routines. Harvest celebrations, saint days, and local fairs often required animals to be tended in particular ways, blessed or prepared for display and trade. These occasions brought added layers of meaning to nightly cohabitation. The cow in the corner was not only a source of warmth or sustenance, but also a participant in larger communal rituals. The cycles of labor, faith, and superstition blended into a cohesive rhythm that defined peasant life in ways both practical and profound. Children learned these rhythms naturally, absorbing the lessons of timing, observation, and care. They understood which sounds in the night signaled danger, which movements indicated health or illness, and how to behave around animals in the dark to prevent accidents. These skills, passed down informally, ensured continuity of survival. The cottage itself became a classroom, a theater of lessons in responsibility, awareness, and interdependence, where the boundaries between human and animal, work and rest, survival and ritual were fluid and ever-present. Through these cycles, the human-animal relationship was reinforced not just by necessity, but by habitual intimacy. The presence of animals in the cottage shaped sleep patterns, dictated the timing of chores, and offered comfort and security against both environmental and social threats. It was a relationship built on dependence, respect, and a keen awareness of rhythm, a rhythm that extended from dawn to dusk and deep into the long nights of the medieval year. Thus the medieval peasant's night was far from idle. It was a continuation of the day's labor, a time of vigilance, care, and quiet reflection. The cycle of seasons dictated the rhythm of sleep, the placement of animals, and the practices of protection and blessing. In every rustle of straw, every lowing cow, every cluck of hens, the peasant family felt the pulse of survival, the pattern of the year, and the subtle guidance of unseen forces, all interwoven into the shared space of their cottage. By understanding these rhythms, we glimpse a life that was disciplined, observant, and deeply attuned to both nature and necessity. The seasonal patterns were not arbitrary, they were life itself, defining the contours of existence, shaping the bonds between humans and animals, and determining the very structure of nightly rest. While the practice of sleeping with animals was widespread among medieval peasants, it was far from uniform. Across Europe, differences in climate, geography, social structure, and local culture created variations in how, why, and with which animals' families shared their homes. By examining these regional distinctions, we gain a clearer understanding of the interplay between necessity, tradition, and environment that shaped peasant life. In the colder regions of northern Europe, such as Scandinavia and the British Isles, the biting chill of winter demanded closer proximity to animals. Peasants in Norway or Scotland often brought cows, sheep, and pigs directly into their cottages, seeking warmth from bodies that radiated heat through the night. Long, harsh winters meant that barns were sometimes too distant or inadequately insulated, and the risk of frostbite or death among livestock was high. The shared warmth of the cottage was a practical solution, one born from necessity rather than cultural preference. Contrast this with regions of southern Europe, such as Italy, Spain, or southern France, where milder winters and more temperate climates allowed for slightly more separation between humans and animals. In these areas, animals might sleep in small outbuildings, walled enclosures, or shared courtyards. Nevertheless, the nighttime proximity was never entirely abandoned. Chickens, goats, and pigs were often brought closer indoors when weather turned, predators threatened, or illness struck the herd. The choice of when and how to cohabitate reflected a delicate balance between comfort, protection, and cultural norms. In mountainous regions, such as the Alps or the Carpathians, the rhythm of human-animal life was also influenced by terrain. Steep slopes and remote pastures required that animals be kept near human dwellings at night to prevent wandering, theft, or predation by wolves and lynxes. Families often constructed multifunctional cottages, with spaces designed to accommodate both livestock and humans, blending walls, pens, and lofts into a single protective environment. In these regions, architecture itself became an expression of necessity, reflecting how geography shaped daily and nightly routines. Regional customs further affected which animals were prioritized for cohabitation. In England, for example, cows and pigs were most commonly kept indoors, given their central role in providing milk, meat, and income through sales or trade. In France, goats often took precedence, particularly in hilly areas where they could graze in accessible slopes, but were more vulnerable at night. In parts of Germany and Austria, poultry were highly valued for both eggs and protection from insects, leading families to create small perches or coops within sleeping quarters. These variations reveal how the local environment, economy, and livestock preferences shaped domestic arrangements. Even within a single country, cultural distinctions were evident. In northern Italy, peasant families integrated animals into courtyards and semi-open structures that allowed air circulation while still offering nighttime shelter. In contrast, families in Lombardy's valleys might bring pigs indoors during the coldest months, reflecting a convergence of practical necessity and inherited tradition. Festivals and communal rituals also played a role, dictating when certain animals were temporarily housed indoors for blessing, slaughter, or celebration, further influencing nightly cohabitation patterns. Climate was not the only determinant. Social and economic status also mattered. Poorer peasants, with fewer resources and no access to barns, relied on intimate cohabitation with livestock for both warmth and security. Wealthier tenants, or those with access to communal barns, could afford to keep animals slightly separated, reducing the risks of odor, disease, or pests. Yet even among wealthier families, certain animals, especially those of highest value, such as a prized cow or breeding sow, were often kept closer at night, reflecting both practical and symbolic concerns. Cultural beliefs and superstitions also varied regionally, influencing how humans and animals interacted after dark. In the British Isles, folklore suggested that animals could sense witches or predict weather, making their proximity a source of reassurance. In Scandinavian tradition, Cows were sometimes thought to carry blessings, and keeping them near was both practical and spiritually protective. In parts of Eastern Europe, rituals surrounding animals often involved charms, prayers, or offerings, reinforcing the connection between household safety, spiritual well-being, and nighttime arrangements. In addition, trade and local economies shaped practices. Communities involved in dairy production, wool harvesting, or pig farming were especially attentive to the care and security of animals, influencing how closely they slept together. Market obligations meant that an animal's health and availability could have immediate financial consequences, so families adapted their routines accordingly. Seasonal fluctuations in trade, taxes, or labor demands also dictated temporary adjustments. Animals might be housed indoors more intensively during winter, or when a market trip required safeguarding valuable livestock. Even the layout of cottages reflected regional adaptations. In northern climates, longhouses were common, with humans and animals under one roof, but separated by partitions, platforms, or straw barriers. In southern regions, separate stables or courtyards were preferred, but nighttime proximity remained flexible. These architectural choices demonstrate the ways in which environment, economy, and cultural custom coalesced to shape a uniquely regional approach to human-animal cohabitation. Comparing practices across regions also highlights a common thread: the blend of necessity, protection, and cultural meaning. While climate, terrain, and wealth dictated some decisions, deeper beliefs about animals as providers, protectors, and spiritual intermediaries underpinned every arrangement. Whether in a snowy northern village or a sun-warmed southern valley, peasants shared a profound intimacy with the creatures that sustained them. Their nights, though shaped by local factors, were united by the rhythms of survival, care, and cohabitation. Ultimately, these regional variations underscore the adaptability of medieval peasants. They responded to their environment with ingenuity, combining practical knowledge, inherited tradition, and cultural beliefs to create living arrangements that maximized both survival and comfort. Cohabitation with animals was not a uniform practice, but a flexible strategy adjusted to meet the specific challenges and opportunities of place, season, and circumstance. Through these comparisons, we can appreciate the remarkable resilience of peasant families across Europe. Despite differing climates, terrains, and cultural norms, the underlying logic remained consistent. The closeness of animals to humans at night was an essential strategy for warmth, protection, and survival. Regional differences illustrate adaptation and innovation, but they also reveal a shared understanding that human life survival and prosperity were intimately tied to the care and presence of animals. In essence, medieval peasant life was a tapestry of local variations, woven together by a universal pattern of cohabitation, ritual, and interdependence. Each household, shaped by its surroundings, reflected a delicate balance between environment, economy, and culture. And within every cottage, in every corner, the shared warmth, care, and presence of animals remained both a practical necessity and a deeply human experience. The practice of sleeping alongside animals left a profound legacy, shaping not only the lives of medieval peasants, but also the cultural, architectural, and social patterns that followed. While the era itself has long passed, its echoes can still be traced in rural practices, folklore, and even modern attitudes toward the intimate bonds between humans and animals. To explore this legacy is to understand how necessity, survival, and companionship created traditions that transcended centuries. Architecturally, the medieval cottage was a blueprint for multifunctional domestic spaces. The careful integration of animal pens, sleeping areas, and hearths demonstrated an early understanding of thermal efficiency, spatial organization, and resource management. Subsequent generations adapted these lessons, designing farmhouses, barns, and homesteads that reflected the wisdom gained from centuries of cohabitation. Thick walls, centralized hearths, lofted sleeping platforms, and flexible interior layouts can all trace inspiration to the ways in which peasants sheltered both themselves and their livestock under one roof. Beyond architecture, the psychological and cultural imprint of these practices persisted. Folk tales, nursery rhymes, and proverbs carried forward the symbolic resonance of animals as protectors, providers, and companions. Stories of cows saving children, dogs warning of danger, or chickens predicting weather reflect centuries of observation and lived experience. Even when the practical necessity of sleeping with animals diminished, these narratives preserved the memory of a world in which human survival was inseparable from the care, warmth, and presence of domestic creatures. The bond formed in these intimate spaces also influenced social values. Peasants learned responsibility, vigilance, and empathy through their nightly interactions with animals. Children grew up understanding the rhythms of care, feeding, observing, and responding to the needs of creatures entirely dependent on them. These lessons, though born from necessity, fostered an ethic of stewardship and interdependence that endured in rural communities long after the end of feudal obligations. The act of sleeping beside animals became a quiet teacher, shaping character and nurturing skills that would serve families for generations. In addition, the shared cohabitation reinforced communal norms and solidarity. Villages were interlinked networks of observation and mutual aid, where the well-being of one household's livestock affected neighbors as well. When a family lost animals to theft, disease, or accident, surrounding households often provided assistance, shared knowledge, or lent animals to maintain productivity. These networks of interdependence, rooted in the necessity of survival alongside animals, contributed to the resilience and cohesion of rural communities. The health implications of these arrangements also left an imprint on human adaptation. Continuous exposure to animals and their microbes shaped immune systems over generations. While modern medicine eventually reduced the risks of zoonotic diseases, historical cohabitation played a role in developing resistance, resilience, and the capacity to live closely with creatures that carried both sustenance and danger. Understanding this connection offers a window into how human biology and environment co-evolved in tightly interwoven domestic ecosystems. Religious and symbolic lessons endured as well. Even as peasant life transformed, the spiritual significance of animals persisted in practices, beliefs, and rituals. Saints' days, blessings of livestock, and protective charms remained part of rural life, echoing centuries-old traditions. Animals were still viewed not merely as property, but as partners in life's continuity, capable of influencing fortune, health, and spiritual well-being. This continuity underscores the lasting interplay between necessity and belief, revealing how intimate human-animal relationships shape culture over centuries. The practical knowledge accumulated during this period also informed agricultural evolution. Techniques for feeding, sheltering, and managing animals indoors during cold months were passed down, eventually informing barn designs, winter housing practices, and animal husbandry strategies across Europe. Farmers learned how to maximize warmth, prevent disease, and maintain productivity through observation and routine. While technology eventually offered new solutions, the foundational wisdom born from centuries of sleeping with animals remained embedded in rural expertise. Cultural memory further immortalized these practices in art, literature, and music. Paintings of medieval life, illuminated manuscripts, and even early folk songs often depict peasants with animals nearby, underscoring the normalcy and significance of this shared space. These images are not mere quaint curiosities, they document lived experience, revealing the rhythms of domestic life, the warmth of proximity, and the interplay of survival, faith, and companionship that defined peasant existence. Moreover, these practices inform modern understandings of human-animal relationships. The intimacy, vigilance, and dependence cultivated in medieval cottages offer insights into the deep-seated human desire for connection with other living beings. Today, while few families sleep with cows or pigs, pets fill analogous roles in offering warmth, comfort, and companionship. The echoes of medieval practices can be traced in our instinct to nurture, protect, and integrate animals into our private lives, reflecting a continuity of human-animal bonding that transcends time. Anthropologists and historians studying peasant life have noted the complex interplay of necessity, symbolism, and ritual in these arrangements. Sleeping with animals was not a simple economic choice, it was a holistic practice encompassing survival, faith, and social cohesion. The lessons learned about vigilance, care, adaptability, and the interdependence of life, remain relevant today, offering insights into how humans have historically negotiated the boundaries between themselves and the natural world. The ethical dimensions of these practices are also noteworthy. Peasants treated animals as vital participants in household life, acknowledging their needs, health, and well-being. While the motivation was often practical, the result was a form of ethical engagement. Attention to feeding, warmth, and protection became a routine moral practice embedded in daily life. This early form of domestic ethics, forged under necessity, contributed to the evolving understanding of human responsibility toward animals in later centuries. Finally, the legacy of sleeping with animals speaks to resilience in the face of hardship. Peasant families endured extreme conditions, poverty, and social constraints by forging intimate bonds with the creatures around them. These bonds provided warmth, protection, sustenance, and psychological comfort. They also fostered resourcefulness, creativity, and a deep understanding of natural cycles. The memory of these practices offers modern audiences a profound lesson. Survival, community, and empathy are intertwined, and human life flourishes when we acknowledge our dependence on and kinship with other living beings. In reflecting on this legacy, we recognize that medieval cottages were not merely shelters, they were ecosystems. Walls enclosed not just humans and animals but centuries of knowledge, ritual, and adaptation. Every night, every shared breath, every rustle in straw bedding contributed to a system of survival, care, and symbolic meaning. The lessons of these cottages extend beyond their time, offering insight into the enduring human capacity to adapt, nurture, and coexist. Thus, the story of peasants sleeping with animals is more than a historical curiosity. It is a narrative of resilience, interdependence, and enduring wisdom. It teaches us about the rhythms of survival, the intertwining of practical and spiritual life, and the deep human need for connection with both the natural world and each other. In these intimate spaces of warmth and necessity, medieval families created a legacy that continues to inform, inspire, and resonate, reminding us that even in the harshest circumstances, life persists through care, companionship, and the quiet bonds that sustain us. The centuries that followed the medieval period brought profound changes to the way humans lived with animals, gradually reshaping the intimate cohabitation that had once been essential for survival. As architecture, agriculture, and social structures evolved, the necessity of sharing sleeping spaces with livestock diminished. Yet the echoes of this medieval practice persisted, leaving a subtle imprint on both rural life and cultural memory. One of the first major transformations occurred with the improvement of building techniques. Timber-framed houses, insulated walls, and separate barns allowed animals to be housed more efficiently and safely outside the human living quarters. In Northern Europe, by the late Middle Ages, communal barns became more common, offering protection from predators and the elements while still keeping livestock accessible. Peasants could maintain warmth and security without enduring the constant closeness of animals at night, reducing exposure to disease and improving comfort. Alongside architectural changes, agricultural practices themselves evolved. Crop rotation, better fodder management, and selective breeding of animals increased productivity, meaning that livestock could be cared for with more distance and precision. Pigs, cows, and chickens could be fed and monitored in separate structures, enabling families to regulate health and hygiene more effectively. While proximity was still valued for observation and warmth, the immediacy of cohabitation was no longer a strict requirement for survival. Economic shifts also influenced domestic arrangements. With trade networks expanding across Europe, livestock became not only a source of subsistence, but also a commodity. Animals housed in barns or stables were easier to manage, sell, and transport. Specialized structures allowed for more efficient milking, feeding, and sheltering practices, reflecting a move from necessity-driven cohabitation to a balance of practicality and economic strategy. The medieval intimacy between humans and animals began to transform into a structured, managed relationship. Despite these changes, cultural habits and beliefs carried forward the medieval intimacy in symbolic or practical ways. Folk practices, superstitions, and seasonal rituals often continued to involve indoor interaction with animals, even if on a reduced scale. Children continued to learn from animals about care, observation, and responsibility. Animals retained symbolic significance in rural communities, appearing in blessings, festivals, and local law. The transition to separate housing did not erase centuries of cultural memory, it simply transformed the context in which human-animal interactions occurred. Technological advances, such as stoves, chimneys, and more efficient heating, further reduced the need for animals as sources of warmth. In homes where heat could be controlled, the proximity of cows or pigs became a choice, rather than a necessity. Rural families could sleep comfortably indoors, without relying on the body heat of livestock, marking a major shift in domestic routines. The night became safer, cleaner, and more restful, though the peasant instinct to integrate animals into the household lingered in traditions and habits. Regional variations persisted, however. In colder or more remote areas, practices closer to medieval norms survived longer. In Scandinavian villages, for instance, winter barns often remained connected to cottages, and families still shared airspace and warmth with animals. In mountainous regions or isolated valleys, barns and stables were sometimes small extensions of living quarters, reflecting continuity with centuries-old survival strategies. These pockets of tradition highlight how environment, climate, and local custom shaped the pace of transition to modern practices. The symbolic and emotional bonds between humans and animals also influenced the evolution of housing. Pets, particularly dogs and cats, became more prominent as animals moved out of primary production roles and into companionship roles. The intimacy of medieval cohabitation shifted toward voluntary closeness, reflecting changing needs and cultural values. The warmth, vigilance, and protection once provided by cows or pigs began to be supplemented by animals kept for loyalty, amusement, and emotional support, showing a gradual transformation of the human-animal relationship from necessity to choice. Public health and hygiene played an equally important role in reshaping domestic practices. Enlightenment thinking and scientific discoveries in the 17th and 18th centuries emphasized cleanliness, sanitation, and disease prevention. Indoor animals were increasingly recognized as potential vectors for illness, prompting families to rethink proximity. Stable design, waste management, and ventilation systems evolved accordingly, creating safer and healthier living environments for both humans and livestock. The lessons of medieval intimacy were preserved in careful observation, but new knowledge encouraged distance and control. Education and social reform further reinforced these changes. Manuals for farming, household management, and animal care provided structured guidance on housing, feeding, and hygiene. These texts formalized practices that had once been passed down informally, combining empirical observation with emerging medical knowledge. The intimate nightly routines of medieval peasants became codified, analyzed, and refined, leading to more efficient, safer, and standardized practices across rural Europe. The transition also influenced cultural memory and storytelling. Tales of medieval cottages, with cows, pigs, and chickens sleeping alongside humans remained a staple of folklore, reminding later generations of a world where survival required constant vigilance, warmth, and collaboration with animals. These stories informed literature, art, and local tradition, offering both nostalgia and moral lessons about responsibility, care, and the interdependence of life. Even as practical necessity waned, the narrative and symbolic significance of cohabitation endured. Ultimately, the shift from medieval cohabitation to modern domestic arrangements reflects a broader human trajectory: adaptation to changing technology, environment, and social organization. While medieval peasants relied on the immediate presence of animals for survival, subsequent generations developed structures, routines, and knowledge that allowed separation without losing warmth, protection, or productivity. The evolution is a testament to human ingenuity and resilience, preserving the core lessons of care, observation, and respect, while reshaping the physical and social space in which they occurred. Yet echoes of the past remain in subtle ways. Farmhouses with attached barns, winter shelters that connect humans and animals, and even pet-keeping practices, all trace back to the intimate rhythms established centuries earlier. Modern understanding of zoonotic disease, animal welfare, and human-animal bonding can be enriched by reflecting on the historical roots of cohabitation. The medieval cottage, once a necessity-driven ecosystem, serves as a reminder of the depth, complexity, and enduring significance of human-animal relationships. In conclusion, the transition to modern practices was gradual, multifaceted, and shaped by environmental, technological, economic, and cultural factors. Sleeping with animals moved from necessity to optionality, from survival to companionship, and from raw proximity to structured care. By tracing this evolution, we gain insight into the ways human ingenuity, observation, and tradition can transform intimate everyday practices, while preserving the lessons of interdependence and care that have endured across centuries. As we draw the story of medieval peasants and their nightly companionship with animals to a close, it is worth pausing to reflect on the timeless lessons woven into these quiet routines. The practice of cohabitation was more than a matter of warmth or convenience. It was a delicate dance of survival, care, and understanding that spanned centuries, cultures, and landscapes. Every shared breath, every lowing cow or rustling straw carried meaning far beyond the walls of the cottage. One of the most profound lessons is the interdependence of life. Peasants relied on animals for heat, food, protection, and guidance, while animals relied on humans for shelter, care, and sustenance. This symbiotic relationship created a rhythm of mutual dependence, a nightly acknowledgement that life is most secure when lived in balance with the beings around us. The medieval cottage, humble as it was, became a microcosm of this universal principle, a lesson as relevant today as it was 6 centuries ago. Observation and attentiveness also emerge as central themes. Living so closely with animals demanded acute awareness. Noticing a subtle cough in a pig, the restless stir of a cow, or the unusual silence of a flock of chickens could mean the difference between health and illness, warmth and exposure, life and death. These skills, honed over generations, illustrate a deep, almost meditative engagement with the world, a calm attentiveness that modern life, with its artificial comforts and distance from nature, often obscures. The integration of practicality, ritual, and symbolism is another enduring lesson. Medieval peasants did not view animals merely as tools or commodities. They were participants in a broader moral, spiritual, and practical universe. Blessings, prayers, seasonal rituals, and folk beliefs intertwined seamlessly with the daily chores of feeding, bedding, and observing livestock. Life was not divided into practical and spiritual, but lived as a holistic continuum, where care for living beings reflected respect for the unseen, as well as the tangible. Adaptability shines through, as well. Across climates, regions, and centuries, peasants adjusted their sleeping arrangements, routines, and practices to meet the demands of cold winters, long summers, high mountains, or remote valleys. They adapted not only to external conditions, but also to social and economic pressures, balancing survival with cultural norms and inherited traditions. This adaptability underscores a fundamental truth. Resilience is born from attentiveness, flexibility, and a willingness to learn from both the environment and the creatures who share it with us. There is also a lesson in humility. The medieval cottage, with its smoke-filled air, straw floors, and low beams, reminds us that life's necessities are often simple. Warmth, sustenance, and companionship were found not in abundance or luxury, but in the presence of living beings and careful attention to their needs. In an age obsessed with complexity and material accumulation, this humility offers a quiet reminder that survival, comfort, and meaning can often be found in the basic, interdependent rhythms of life. Equally important is the understanding of community and shared responsibility. Individual households depended not only on their own animals, but also on the vigilance, knowledge, and assistance of neighbors. Theft, disease, or predation required cooperation, reinforcing bonds that extended beyond the walls of a single cottage. The presence of animals shaped not only the household but the village, creating a network of care and observation that exemplifies the social dimension of interdependence. The intimate bonds formed through shared nights also highlight the emotional dimension of life in the medieval cottage. Animals provided warmth, reassurance, and a quiet companionship that softened the harshness of labor, weather, and scarcity. The simple act of sleeping beside a cow or a dog was imbued with comfort, a nightly assurance that the family was not alone against the challenges of the world. These emotional connections remind us that empathy and care are timeless forces, bridging species and generations alike. Reflection also invites us to consider the continuity between past and present. While modern homes rarely house livestock, the principles endure in different forms. Pets, companion animals, and therapeutic animals offer warmth, vigilance, and emotional support, echoing centuries-old practices. Farming, gardening, and ecological stewardship continue to teach attentiveness, care, and interdependence. In these ways, the medieval lessons of cohabitation remain relevant, subtly shaping modern life and reminding us of our deep connection to the living world. Furthermore, these practices illustrate the profound integration of rhythm, routine, and natural cycles. Seasonal work, daily chores, and nightly care were all interconnected, creating a sense of flow and purpose. Life followed the rise and fall of the sun, the change of seasons, and the needs of both humans and animals. This harmonious rhythm, both practical and spiritual, offers a model for mindful living, an awareness that every action, no matter how small, contributes to the well-being of the household, the community, and the broader environment. Finally, there is a lesson in storytelling itself. The narratives of medieval peasants, their cottages, and their animals endure because they capture universal truths about survival, care, and interconnection. By listening to these stories, reflecting on their rhythms, and imagining the warmth and movement of the cottage at night, we connect not only to history, but to timeless principles of human and animal life. The stories encourage curiosity, empathy, and reflection, allowing listeners to internalize lessons gently, as though drifting into sleep within the comforting patterns of centuries-old wisdom. In conclusion, the shared nights of medieval peasants and their animals were a convergence of survival, care, spirituality, and intimacy. They demonstrate the importance of observation, attentiveness, adaptability, humility, community, and emotional connection. They show us that warmth and protection are not merely physical, but arise from careful, respectful interaction with the world around us. And they remind us that even the simplest routines, repeated nightly for generations, can carry profound meaning, shaping character, culture, and the enduring bonds between species. As you drift into sleep, imagine the flickering firelight, the gentle breathing of cows and pigs, and the quiet companionship of creatures who shared both warmth and watchfulness. Let these images guide you into a calm, reflective state, connecting past and present, human and animal, survival and care. In the silence of night, there is continuity, wisdom, and a gentle reminder: life thrives where attention, compassion, and shared presence are honored, and the lessons of the past continue to resonate softly in every heartbeat, every breath, and every shared moment of connection.